Hello. I hope all of you can hear me. And those of you who aren't paying attention, I hope we will commence instantly. Thank you. We had a tremendous morning session here, by the way. My name is Don Eron. I'm the treasurer, actually, of the CU chapter of the American Association of University Professors. I'm on the executive committee of the Colorado State Conference. I'm also, of some relevance to today's events, I'm also on Committee A of the National Aaup on Academic Freedom and Tenure. We'll talk about that in a little while. I'm going to begin by talking, I'm sorry to tell you this, I'm going to talk for 15 or 20 minutes. If I sense that you're not paying attention, it'll be 25 or 30 minutes. Them's the rules. And also I'm going to begin a little bit by pitching the AAUP. I understand that for you who are actually here, that may not be particularly necessary, but I'm sort of doing it for that little camera right there. Okay, so act interested. I'll do my best. As I say, I would like to talk about the AAUP for a few minutes. I've often thought that being a tenured professor at a research university is the best job in America. Any tenured professors here? Oh, cool. This is for you. We're going to have a little talk. If you don't already know, you might find it of interest that almost every privilege you enjoy as a member of the academic profession, the academic freedom and job security that comes with tenure, the control over pedagogy and curriculum that is the fruit of shared governance, and a professional status equivalent to that enjoyed by members of the medical and legal professions stems from the AAUP. Have you ever wondered why, if you're on the same page with me about this being a great job, being a tenured professor at a research university, have you ever wondered how that happened? Did you think that maybe at some point early in the 20th century, the trustees and the presidents and the public thought, gee, we really love the eggheads, we trust the eggheads. Let's give them complete control over the curriculum, what they teach our kids, and more job security than anyone else has, including us. Let's allow them to think they're working for the good of society, not that they're working for us. Let's let them yell about how terrible we are at the top of their lungs and fix it so there's nothing we can do about it. That's how much we like the eggheads. By the way, that was an actual recording of somebody in 1915. You seem like a jovial bunch, so I thought I'd try some levity. That wasn't an actual recording of someone in 1915.
Back when people had some chutzpah.
Everything you like about your job is because of an idea that the AAUP and its membership advanced and enforced until the 1915 and 1940 statements on academic freedom and tenure became the basis for institutional policy at every self-respecting college or university in the country. The reason the AAUP was so successful is because of people like my father. I want to tell you something about him briefly. He was a full professor for over 40 years and won most every lifetime achievement award in his field. He was a social and developmental psychologist. In those 40 plus years, he never attended an AAUP meeting. He never voted in an AAUP election. But here's the thing. He was a member. In a nutshell, that's why you enjoy so much of what you have today, because of my dad. I have with me the original 1915 AAUP membership list of CU faculty. There are 25 members, about what there are today. I'm just going to read some names, and I don't know how many of your CU faculty are familiar with the campus, but if you begin to see a theme, feel free to raise your hand. I'm not going to call on you. Just for purposes of my visual recognition, feel free to raise your hand. J.B. Eckley, J.D. Fleming, F.B.R. Helms, J.R. Hunter, M.S. Ketchum. Some of you see a theme here. M.F. Libby, George Norland, Francis Ramelais, J.F. Willard. I think my favorite is J.D. Fleming. Okay, when we build a name a building after the guy. What kind of discipline are we going to house there? Well, let's look at his initials, JD. Oh, let's let that be the law school. By the way, the president in 1915 of the University of Colorado was Livingston Farron. 9 out of the original 25 AAUP members have buildings on the CU campus named after them. By this metric, and this metric only, if you join the AAUP, you have a 36% chance of having a building named after you. Your grandchildren will be proud. Actually, for some of you, by the time your grandchildren are adults, there won't be anything called tenure, at least as we know it today, unless a lot more faculty members become quite a bit more like my father. I mentioned earlier, I'm a member of the National AAUP's Committee A on Academic Freedom and Tenure. Among many other things, we oversee investigations of institutions that fail to adhere to AAUP policies and recommend these institutions for censure. A couple of years ago, we censured MD Anderson, Matt Anderson in Houston, not because of their cancer treatments, we had no opinion about that, but because as a teaching hospital, they eliminated tenure and replaced it with, quote, term tenure. What term tenure means is that you have tenure until the end of your term, and then you have to reapply for your job. Having to periodically reapply for your job is not really something that encourages one to challenge the status quo. They might not want you around for the next term. If you're wondering how term tenure might be distinct from multi-year appointments, it's reasonable to wonder. My prediction is that within another 25 years or so, unless faculty members become more like my father, tenure will still exist, but it will be term tenure. After I started challenging the status quo, sometimes through my participation in faculty government, I served in the BFA with some of you. Some of you may remember my instructor tenure initiatives with Suzanne Hudson. And for about 10 years, I was on the personnel committee of the faculty council. I observed a conundrum. It was perplexing. Whenever an initiative came forward, I would try to apply AAUP principles. What I discovered is that many faculty participants in faculty government appear to despise the AAUP. Even though every AAUP policy is designed to protect faculty, these faculty seem to feel, and I guess take it that this is the case, that the AAUP is radical, extreme, unyielding. The goal of the AAUP has always been to protect the sanctity of tenure, and the organization has long been conflicted about non-tenure track faculty, such as me. If I had not managed to regain my job on those occasions my program tried to fire me, I doubt that the National AAUP, at least back then, would have stood up for me. Perhaps I flatter myself, but I like to think that the CU chapter might have huffed and puffed a little. Marky?
Huff, huff.
There you go. So here I was. By the way, I am encouraged by that huffing and puffing, just hearing it. So here I was, someone about whom the AAUP was conflicted and had never really done anything, often fighting to strengthen the job protections of tenured faculty for whom the AAUP was responsible for most everything they valued about the best job in America. And these tenured faculty would resist, often vehemently. I had many heated discussions in faculty government where I was trying to strengthen protections for tenured faculty against the vehement objections of tenured faculty. When the day comes that tenure becomes term tenure, these guys are not going to fight for you. In fact, by then your protections may have become so compromised that no one will notice. People are strange. That brings me to Ward Churchill. That's my segue to Ward Churchill. I've been working on it for the last week.
That's right. Good memory.
I'm going to talk now about the report of the Research Misconduct Committee that found Ward Churchill guilty of numerous academic crimes. I'm also going to talk a little about the Colorado AUP Conference's report on the termination of Ward Churchill. Those of you who have read the report or who know something about the Churchill case will note that there are many things about the case that I am not going to say in the next few minutes, and many injustices that the Research Misconduct Committee did to Churchill that I am not going to mention. You'll have to read the report for the full story. As I only have a few minutes, I'm only going to mention a few examples that especially interest me today. In October 2012, after the Colorado Supreme Court turned down Ward Churchill's appeal, the Denver Post ran an editorial. The Post said it was clear at the end of the day that Churchill wasn't fired for his opinions, but because of his, quote, academic deceit. As the lead author of the Colorado Conference's 136-page report on the termination of Ward Churchill, which had only recently been published in the Journal of Academic Freedom, I felt that this Post editorial writer hadn't completely internalized my report. I felt burdened by this editorial, so I wrote an op-ed in response. Here is part of what I wrote. The report on the termination of Ward Churchill concludes that the Research Misconduct Panel convicted Churchill of academic crimes that he did not commit. The panel declared a standard method of interpretation to be academic misconduct. It disregarded Churchill's sources and then claimed he had no sources. It faulted him for citation practices that some on the panel used themselves. It contrived new charges against Churchill based on standards designed to protect scholars in Churchill's position. The AAUP report, based on careful study of over 17,000 pages of documentation, concludes that the CU investigation into Churchill's scholarship was a sham. Many other scholars and experts have reached the same conclusion. As one expert, Stanley Fish, I don't always agree with Stanley Fish. You may be interested in knowing.
I always agree with Stanley Fish.
Very well put. As Stanley Fish declared in the New York Times, if the standards for dismissal adopted by the Churchill Committee were generally enforced, hardly any of us professors would have jobs. The Post didn't print the piece, by the way, because they said it was written in response to a Post editorial. They said if they publish op-eds in response to their editorials, that's all they'd ever publish. It's on our Colorado AAP website if you're interested. I recently clicked on the Journal of Academic Freedom and reread the report for the first time in several years. One thing that struck me was toward the end of the report, my co-authors, Suzanne Hudson and Myron Hewlin. Suzanne's in Malaysia on a river trip at the moment. Myron's supposed to be here.
He's sick.
He's sick. Not in general, but today. In this report, toward the end, we just seem to be throwing up our arms. How many different ways can we describe the permutations that this Research Misconduct Panel went through in order to convict Ward Churchill of research misconduct? For example, one guy on the panel, observing that Churchill had used the term circumstantial evidence, looked the term up in Black's Legal Dictionary. It turns out that as a term of art, circumstantial evidence means something different than it does as a colloquialism, the way that Churchill obviously intended the term. This guy scrutinized Churchill's evidence and then adjudged that, in his view, it didn't reach the legal threshold for circumstantial evidence. Thus, the panel adjudged by a preponderance of the evidence that Churchill had committed research misconduct. Interesting, this fellow conceded that this one incident of misconduct didn't amount to all that much, but the panel was obligated to adjudge the charges, and taken together with the other charges, some negligible, some major, the panel detected a clear pattern of deceit, where Churchill fabricated myths in order to advance his agenda of ideological propaganda. He got it right that some of Churchill's other crimes were negligible. For example, in some instances, Churchill put a footnote at the end of a paragraph instead of at the end of a sentence. By the way, any of you scholars here? I mean, whenever I put a citation in, I have to use a little bit of judgment. And it's entirely possible that someone, in certain instances, could second guess my judgment. He also sometimes did not use pinpoint citations when, in the judgment of the panel, he did not have a good reason for not using pinpoint citations, and thus it was research misconduct. The reason he didn't use them, according to the panel, wasn't what Churchill said, but because, as a strategy of deceit, he wanted to make it as difficult as possible for anyone to verify that his sources were fabricated. Interestingly, when it comes to not using pinpoint citations, the member of the panel who excoriated Churchill the longest and loudest did not use pinpoint citations in one of her books on 480 occasions. But she had a good reason. Her publisher told her not to. The panel also convicted Churchill of more major academic crimes. All those were specious. To get back to Aaup philosophy, if you were to look at the AauP's 1940 statement on academic freedom and tenure, which is essentially the AauP's defining document, you might be surprised to find that it's not the stellar defense of academic freedom you might expect. In fact, academic freedom, particularly individual academic freedom, is far from unlimited. Luckily, however, the limits to individual academic freedom are defined not by the donors or the trustees of an institution, the governor, the legislature, the public, or the Rocky Mountain News, but by the scholar's field of inquiry. This is because the scholars in one's field of inquiry are the ones who, unlike these other agents, can be expected to know what they are talking about. Does that sound complicated? Ward Churchill's field is American Indian Studies. It is a field in which most scholars view Indian history through the lens of critical race theory and consider methods of statutory and historical interpretation as practiced by many scholars in other fields to be unreliable. Not because scholars in AIS, as it's called, wish to create myths, but because the standard primary sources were often written by colonialists disingenuous in their concerns about the unfortunate plight of the Indian, or maybe oral accounts from Indians who are terrified of offending the white man. You can't trust these sources, they say, so they are challenged to devise more reliable methods. There is a telling moment in the report of the Privilege and Tenure Committee. Eric Chaffetz, a legal scholar and a legal expert and leading scholar in AIS, has explained to the committee that one of the academic misconduct charges against Churchill regards a standard and well-justified method of arriving at the truth, as practiced by many scholars in Churchill's field. According to the P&T report, advocates of these views, such as scholars in Churchill's field, might not find the evidence in favor of a finding of misconduct against Churchill as persuasive as we do. That was a remarkable moment in the history of academic freedom. The perspective of Churchill's field, AIS, has been explained to the CU committee, and they admit that they privilege their perspective about what constitutes viable scholarly methods in Churchill's field over the perspective of the scholars in Churchill's field, and thus Churchill is guilty of committing an academic crime. What can you do in the face of such brazen sophistry other than shout, "No, no, please, no, their perspective is the perspective," in defining the parameters of their field? You don't get to do that. They do. I am not a scholar in the field of AIS, but I can tell you this. The report of the Research Misconduct Panel, which contained no scholars in Churchill's field, and has provided so much of the intellectual justification for the destruction of Ward Churchill's reputation, is a dishonest report. I doubt very much that the faculty members on this panel were motivated by dishonesty, with one possible exception, a specialist in American Indian law whose work is discredited by scholars in the field of AIS. They are distinct fields with conflicting perspectives, and who must have thought that he was getting away with murder because there was no one on the committee to dispute his authoritative proclamations as dubious. But the Scrum report, that's what it's called, Subcommittee for Research Misconduct, Scrum, report that convicted Churchill was the inevitable result of a committee that was incompetent and arrogant. This is a committee that was completely unfamiliar with the issues and methods of the scholars in AIS and completely uninterested. When they were informed of those methods by the specialists in the field, they decided that they knew better than the specialists in the field. I know that some of you who are hearing me say this, who have read the Scrum report but not the Colorado AAUP report, may think that I am hopelessly biased, that I am pro-Churchill. If you're determined to believe that, there's probably nothing I can say to convince you otherwise. I'll tell you this, though. I found the report quite convincing when I first read it. With great conviction, they talk about the many times that Churchill footnotes sources for substantiation that do not back up his claims, and how, bending over backwards to give Churchill the benefit of the doubt, they undertook their own searches to locate sources, but that there are none. They talk about how, when he's not footnoting sources that don't support his claims, Churchill footnotes articles that he's ghostwritten to give the appearance of independent substantiation as a pattern of deception to advance his agenda of ideological propaganda, namely that the native population disappeared as a result of intentional genocide by the white population. Here is where their incompetence and arrogance is at play. Churchill makes a claim in 3 paragraphs of a much longer essay about the General Allotment Act of 1887. He says that the GAA, as it's called for a blood quantum test for Indians to prove that they are eligible to receive the benefits of the act. To test Churchill's claim, the Research Misconduct Committee ran the GAA through a word check and could detect no literal requirement in the language of the act calling for a blood quantum test. They then went to his sources, none of which substantiated that the language of the act literally called for a blood quantum test. Thus, Churchill was guilty of major acts of fabrication, so brazen that everything that followed, no matter how negligible it might appear, and I've given you some examples, in the judgment of the panel, fleshed out Churchill's pattern of deceit. The problem with this finding is that Churchill never claimed that the language of the act literally required a blood quantum test. However, as numerous AIS scholars testified to the Research Misconduct Committee, a standard approach to statutory interpretation is to take into consideration not only the language of the law, but the law's implementation and effects. After all, there are many racist laws in which the literal language of the law does not betray the intention. In the view of these scholars, a contextual interpretation elicits a truer understanding than just reviewing the literal language of the statute. That was Churchill's approach, obviously. And when the standard scholarly method is taken into consideration, suddenly his sources support his claims. Nonetheless, because Churchill used this normative method of statutory interpretation, the Research Misconduct Committee convicted him of falsification and fabrication regarding the GAA of 1887. It would be akin to convicting a scholar of academic misconduct for claiming that Trump's travel ban is anti-Muslim because the language of the ban does not literally say so. If, and I don't have an opinion on this, if there are legitimate issues with the normative methods in the entire field of American Indian studies, if those methods are controversial, they should be debated in an academic setting and not in a disciplinary hearing with only one side of the controversy represented among the inquisitors. People are strange. By the way, that's what connects this with the first part of my talk. People are strange. The Research Misconduct Committee was explicit that one reason they were so severe in their assessment of Churchill was that he wouldn't back down. He wouldn't accept that he was wrong, when they told him he was wrong. He wouldn't, as Stanley Fish said, denounce himself. Even though it might have saved his job, he wouldn't defer to the findings of this panel composed of one Indian law specialist and 4 others who were unfamiliar with and uninterested in the methods and issues common in American Indian studies, and who, as is obvious from the transcripts, at every step presumed Churchill to be guilty as charged or a liar, and who, based on their report, were more interested in mansplaining than in deferring to the IAS scholars who testified to the rationality and validity of Churchill's methods. Perhaps Churchill did not back down because he did not believe that they knew what they were talking about. I'm not much good at predicting the future, but I'll predict one thing. In his speech today, Ward Churchill, where is he? Even in the room? Are you even here? Oh, good. I have a prediction. We'll see. We'll see how good I am at this predicting thing. In his speech today, Ward Churchill will not back down. Ladies and gentlemen, Ward Churchill.
CEO, proceed. Hi, how you doing? Okay? You're doing good. That's what I heard. Well, I'm going to invite some condemnation first. I brought the weather with me. I bring it everywhere I go. Okay? I brought the longest cold snap in the history of Atlanta, Georgia to Atlanta when I first went down there, and I intend to keep it up. I'm back here. I am back here at what? You know, being away from Boulder has allowed me for a period of time to reflect upon when I first came to Boulder. This place is incomprehensible to me at this point, and already was by the time I left. But we should leave that. When I wrote an email to my sometime co-author Jim Vanderwall, sitting over here, said that I had been invited to an academic freedom conference at the University of Colorado Boulder. He said, University of Colorado Boulder, academic freedom. Was this some kind of post thing, like postmodernism, post-structuralism? Yeah. And that's actually a way of raising a point. Much commentary has been made about absence of tenured faculty. There are tenured faculty here, but most of them not from this institution. And actually a few of them not working anywhere in Colorado. And the personal aspects and the particulars of my case notwithstanding, it doesn't seem to have registered on the tenured faculty on this flagship campus in the state of Colorado is that the judicial opinion rendered to vacate the jury verdict in my case, upheld at the appellate level in the Colorado courts and confirmed by the Supreme Court of the state of Colorado, voided all your tenure. You may have a document in the contract that says you've got it, and what it doesn't say is, per that Supreme Court confirmation of the lower court opinions, is that tenure has no relevance at all. You serve at the contingency of the regents of the University of Colorado, who act in the capacity, a quasi-judicial capacity in personnel matters, that they can fire you irrespective of violations of your rights in terms of a faculty contract or the Constitution of the United States. The judicial opinion that was rendered in my case made no particular argument that the case had not been made, that there was a systematic violation of constitutional rights in my case. Nonetheless, the regents were immune for reasons of quasi-judicial standing from any consequence through the court to those constitutional violations. That seems to me to be a rather consequential judicial interpretation with some implications for not only faculty members in the institutions, those with tenure, those pursuing tenure, doesn't really matter. But really, with respect to constitutional rights in society as a whole, because the doctrine of quasi-judicial immunity and immunities of various other sorts have been continuously expanding in judicial opinions in the United States over the past 2 generations, to the point where zoning boards can no longer be challenged because of their quasi-judicial status and ruling that your neighborhood shall now become a shopping center or a landfill or a whatever. Yeah, it may be a violation of your rights, may be a violation of property rights, may be a violation, I don't even believe in all of these things necessarily, but the bulk of the population at least thinks they do, and when it affects them, they very much do, and those are being taken away. The Bill of Rights secures your rights only vis-a-vis action by the government, and the government itself is being systematically ruled immune from any kind of consequence to a violation of those very rights. Where does that leave anyone? So it's not simply a matter of tenure. The elite, as it's called, those who would pursue tenure, those who think it's a good idea, those in adjunct capacity seeking full-time work, it really is much more broadly structured than that, the threat that's posed in this society as a whole. Now, this is only effective in Colorado at the moment, but in citing precedent in cases bearing on cases in other jurisdictions, it will be invoked. Regard to my case, the specifics of it, well, I'm just gonna look at Don Eron and say what he said. Okay? I could say some more, but what he said. I'll take one minor exception to the framing of that. And I want to affirm that he's not some Ward Churchill fan. I'd never met the man prior to the commencement of the investigation. Wouldn't have known him from the mayor of Boulder, who also wouldn't have known if we walked into them down there in that, what used to be a street. Okay? I don't think this was a methodological dispute. That was the framing that was used by this faculty lynch mob. And I'll come back to that in a moment. That was an ideological dispute, which takes me to certain cognitive dissonance that I've always experienced with regard to the AAUP that I'll lay out in a moment. And I gave fair warning that I was going to say this. Okay. And he said, go ahead, great. Apparently because it concurs. I say lynch mob because the entity that was formed and was handpicked, and people who on methodological, disciplinary or other grounds much more qualified to assess the accusations against me ruled out. On the, well, one of the fathers of critical race theory, which was pointed out methodologically relevant to my discipline, Richard Delgado, was disqualified from being a member of the investigative committee based on 2 factors. One, he hadn't had the most cordial relationship with the administration of the University of Colorado while he was teaching here, and therefore might be inclined to rule against the university's interests. I didn't know that was a criteria for what the findings were supposed to be. This is an objective fact-finding body. but not catering to the interests of the university as defined by the administration wasn't one of the criteria. The other reason stated why he was inappropriate to be seated was because he had obligations elsewhere and might therefore not be able to make all of the investigative committee meetings. Okay? Fairly clear. You can quibble with it, you can agree with it, you can disagree with it, but no matter what you want to do with it, you can't square it up to the fact that then proceeded to appoint a literature professor down at the University of Texas by the name of Jose Limon, known as the administration's secret weapon against Chicano studies at that institution, to a seat on the investigative committee. My field is not English literature, nor is it Chicano studies. But that latter, if he was actually a scholar, it would be closer. Jose Limon was unable to make a single meeting of the investigative committee, but that didn't disqualify him. The chair, selected from the law school, right over there, Fleming was still Fleming at the time, was selected on the basis of being a former prosecutor who was approached to be on the investigative committee and agreed to do so only on the basis that she be appointed the chair of the committee. Once again, I will say that the rules state that the investigative committee will be an impartial, fact-finding body. I asked Mimi Wesson on the first day of the investigative proceedings, well, one, what standards are going to be used in the assessment? She couldn't tell me. And two, how should I frame my responses to the investigative committee, the questions that they posed? And her answer, you should consider yourself in the position of a defendant in a criminal proceeding. Impartial, objective, fact-finding body. No, this is, well, another word that's in there is non-adversarial. This is specifically adversarial framing. That's the judicial process. The criminal process is an adversarial process. And she proceeded that way. The committee was run that way. The process here was such that I was entitled to legal defense, but that my lawyer could not frame a single question by way of cross-examination. No point in him being there. My own questions could not be posed verbally in the investigative hearings. Various witnesses, including my own, would be brought. Okay, the committee members could interact verbally. Me, volume of publication notwithstanding, I typed like this. Okay? I had to sit and type in such questions as I wanted posed and email them across the room to the committee chair, the prosecuting attorney, who would then pose them, revising as she felt appropriate, to the point where the questions sometimes were the opposite of themselves, and completely discombobulated witnesses. Got people who went on record in the subsequent proceedings that said that it was virtually impossible to figure out what they were supposed to say because they weren't quite sure what the question was because they were being qualified by an intermediate party. And if I wanted further clarification on the point they raised, well, there's, at this rate, there would be no real possibility. Okay. I made one critical error in coming over here, which is I forgot to bring my water. So, one moment. Dry mouth does not facilitate reasonably good speaking. Thank you. The point here is that you've got people who are not pursuing a methodological dispute resolution in their favor. They're not upholding some Yeah, I see people nodding their heads. I won't belabor that any further. What they were doing was essentially repealing an interpretation of the historical reality of the United States, which ran sharply contrary to what is generally called the master narrative. All right? The touchy-feely, well, mistakes were made, there were occasional tragedies, you got anomalies out there, but essentially you've got this exceptionally good and benevolent force in the universe that whatever its problems is perpetually getting better, and don't you think that it's going to be better next year than it was last, being led to that conclusion. A way of sanitizing the history to make it, well, if not all comfortable in its entirety, at least acceptable within parameters that distinguish it from other horror shows that history reveals. I take the opposite tack. The rule of interpretation that would apply to, say, the Third Reich should also apply here. The rule of interpretation that would apply to a totalitarian dictatorship and the upshot of that should apply here. If there's a standard of justice and interpretation out there, it applies to all parties equally. The United States, exceptionalist arguments to the contrary notwithstanding, is not entitled to be exempt. That's my method, if you will. Yeah. The long and the short of it. Well, that was what was to be repealed. Actually, Don misframed a little bit. I never wrote at 3 paragraphs length in a single essay about the General Allotment Act. You got a paragraph, that's a max. I did it in several different essays where it came up, varying lengths of paragraph, 2-3 sentences, I think the longest probably being 5. But I also made reference to the deliberate infection of American Indians with smallpox. I mentioned Fort Clark, 1837 in the upper Missouri River with the Mandans and other Missouri River peoples as being one of the examples of that happening. The longest exposition I ever made on Fort Clark, as it was called, that's standard in the literature, references to Fort Clark. As it turns out, having been subjected to this extensive interrogation on this, I've looked much more closely at Fort Clark, and that's a somewhat erroneous thing. Didn't begin at Fort Clark, but it did center on Fort Clark, ultimately. The pandemic that was unleashed in 1837. The longest exposition I had there was 2 sentences. 2 sentences. Marjorie McIntosh, the emeritus distinguished historian appointed to deal with that, or she appointed herself, they divided up the work among the charges, devoted well nigh 80 pages of rebuttal. Now this is not saying Churchill couldn't substantiate it, Churchill was methodologically lacking, he didn't have relevant citations that would support that. She's actively attempting to disprove and provide the narrative you were to understand of how this came to be. There's no other possible way you rejoin 2 to 3 sentences with a couple footnotes, a couple citations, in a manner requiring 80 pages to seal off possibilities. Of course, once they began their interrogation on this, I handed them more information. All right? How did you arrive at the estimated number attributed to Russell Thornton in terms of the total number of people who died of smallpox as a result of the unleashing of this? Well, here's the pages I cited in Thornton. Okay? Shorthand. Remember, I'm not writing an essay on Fort Clark and that smallpox expedition. This is a sentence. Look at Thornton. Look on that page. Okay, well, no, he doesn't say this high number. Okay, and I posited various numbers. Thornton would indicate that it was possible that the total body count ran to 100 or 300 or 400,000 people. Depends on how you want to frame it. Well, he doesn't say any of those. What he does say in a parenthetical, because that's the scholarly format used, that you should look to these. He's running out a string of peoples who were afflicted in the pandemic that occurs 1837-38, and look at the following sources for the numbers, the details with regard to each. Well, Stearns and Stearns, which I also, the effect of smallpox on the Amerindian, as they titled it, a book from the 1940s, page range, I corroborate with him, he cites this, okay, including California, he says in the list of indigenous peoples afflicted. Okay, look to Stearns and Stearns, page range. In that page range, which both he and I cite, there's a chart. It says high count estimated for California, 300,000. That one locale alone. After that, it's just arithmetic. Now, Thornton had a parenthetical in there that said the California high count was probably exaggerated. So once I've done the arithmetic, just do some subtraction. How much exaggerated? Seems to me that taking it down 300,000 people from the possible high would be pretty charitable in terms of interpreting exaggeration. Valid citation. What is the appearance that after all of this exhaustive research to disprove what I had said, there was an inability of the investigative, this is an archival historian I might add, the investigative panel member to even so much as read the text of the sources cited. Yeah. Well, the devoting of the 8 pages to rebuttal is what takes it out of the realm of methodology and places it squarely in the realm of ideology. And it's the reinforcement of the master narrative that's at issue. And the reason that that report was actually published, research misconduct findings are not normally published, but it's electronically published, hanged on a website by the University of Colorado, published under their imprimatur, and with repeated embellishments in the press as to the academic excellence of the committee that had been assembled, all full professors. We had a Mandan, that would be the people afflicted at Fort Clark, a tribal historian, traditionalist, and a professor. Oh, I'm sorry, he was only an associate professor, so he wasn't appropriate to be seated on the committee. Instead, they select a white woman. Okay, that's not an unforgivable sin. Very senior, emeritus, in fact. Also not an unforgivable sin, whose specialty is medieval English women's history, archival. I'm relying on oral history. She took a course at Harvard once in the 1950s, and so she's competent in oral history too. It ultimately determines that I was guilty of disrespect to oral tradition by agreeing with Michael Yellowbird, who was the Mandan witness. He testified to this effect, although he was denied a seat on the investigative committee. So it's not just methodology, it's actually the content, what's at issue, the uncomfortability of it. Incidentally, there's a real interesting little aspect to the Margie McIntosh thing, which sort of frames this in ideological terms for me even more sharply. She was ultimately willing to concede that it was entirely possible that some white people, undefined, although we have a cast of characters you sort of constrain it to, all of whom she's named, somebody may have deliberately infected the Indians. Okay. And she was okay with putting that out, conceding that possibility, so long as it was not the United States Army. Although the guy who that was my historical fabrication, okay? That I attributed this to the United States Army, despite the fact that the downriver agent, Joshua Pilcher, is a rank of major. The guy who handed the blanket across, William Fulkerson, Army Major, okay? Fort Clark is a site of an Indian agency. Under the ruling at the time, any privately constructed post used as an Indian agency and a disbursement point for annuities would be effectively under the control of the military, even though it may be operated by the private owners. Yeah, I said the U.S. Army did this. The military, in effect, did this. Well, you couldn't prove it was the military, and it was owned privately by a fur enterprise. And these guys did not command troops, although I can show you grade school textbooks that are put out for American history that were in use even at that time by Lucent publication that show uniformed troops. Kids are being taught this, but that's not academic conduct. It's academic misconduct. You understand? I say that frames it in ideological terms for me with some startlingly crystal clarity, because I can talk about another institution, intellectual, academic, scholarly, institutional context, and popular context as well, in which, while we must concede these crimes were committed, 3 million odd people, most of them Jews, lined up along anti-tank dishes, shot in the back of the head and dumped in. It's a little hard to hide. This happened. We must concede it happened, but it was the SS, not the Wehrmacht. So long as it was not the German army, the honor of which must be maintained intact, you could concede the absolution in German scholarship of the Wehrmacht included for 40 years. This was an ideological contest. This was not a methodological contest. It's only been within the past generation, with the publication of War of Annihilation and several other volumes, that sort of defense barrier has been broken down. And the full-fledged participation, the enthusiastic, in many cases, participation of the German army, not just the ideological SS, has been established, documented, the photographs published, and so on. We had a sort of a minor parallel to that occurring here. My reference to the lady in question was that she functioned as a military jock sniffer, a common malady in American life. But it is the mainstream ideological construction of the United States which is being asserted here and maintained. My great offense that triggered all this was saying that people who starved children to death in Malaysia for profit maximization in order to further their own prestige, financial benefit, are probably the moral and functional equivalent of Adolf Eichmann. You can't say that. People who were involved in merely in commerce, I don't know. You can't say that about people involved in merely in commerce. You might want to try taking a read at the Crime and Punishment of I.G. Farben sometime, because the U.S. prosecuted those corporate officials at Nuremberg, not for killing people, but for using slave labor. Other people presided over the laborers and did the killing for them, in providing the means and the rationality and the infrastructure by which the killing occurred, profited from it, harnessed their competence and their expertise and their technocratic proficiency to making that happen. And for that matter, the individual Eichmann did the same thing. That was the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt was on about. She went expecting to confront a monster when she went to Tel Aviv for the trial of the so-called architect of the Holocaust, and what she encountered was a mouse. Every man. This decrepit little creature who could arrange train schedules and file the paperwork that allowed the transportation of the Jews from France to Poland, or Czechoslovakia to Poland, or Hungary to Poland. Yeah, maybe he had a bad attitude, but he wasn't prosecuted for his attitude. He was prosecuted for those particular functions, which involved the literal direct killing of no one, but increased his personal prestige and standing. Well, this is not going to square. This kind of interpretation is not going to square with the master narrative. I'll take it no further than that. Other than to say, I still hear from my students, and that includes conservatives. I had a lot of students over the years, not so many in any given batch, but over the years, a lot of students thought they mouthed the company line, what it was they thought I believed and wanted to hear, but didn't really bother to provide much support for the argument. It didn't do so awful well in my courses. I had some conservatives who took positions that I wouldn't agree with, but did actually go through the motions in an appropriate fashion to support their argument with something more than sound bites gleaned from Sean Hannity the night before. Okay? So I hear from the conservatives right along with the dread liberals and the occasional radical who's actually engaged in doing good work on the ground. And there's some of each. Okay? It raises a question for me. There's a lot of what has been addressed here today, and I didn't disagree with a lot of it. I have points of disagreement. I don't know if the radical labor movement from the turn of the 19th century is the place we need to look in a lot of respects for an antidote to the circumstances. I mean, yeah, it dealt with immigrants, but they had this problem with black people. Big problem with black people. Well, I'll admit it, in Southwest, they had a problem with the brown variant of black people. This is a white radical movement. Reference to Jay Sakai, who I do agree with. I didn't disagree with what they were trying to accomplish. I was disagreeing, would have disagreed at the time, with the way they constrained it to a privileged elite, if you will. Although these are industrial workers, not the kind of elite we've been talking about. But they were being organized, and who they were being organized by often were individuals you could call organic intellectuals. John Reed, for example, would qualify as that. He had a higher quality of discourse and analysis that was occurring at the time. And this takes me to a somewhat different framing than what's been employed throughout the discussion thus far today. In the book called The Last Intellectuals by Russell Jacoby, it's been out quite a while, it's probably not even in print anymore, but it's still very much available. And it's not a great book, but it had some very interesting information that I assimilated. And he pointed out that during the period we're talking about, when the IWW was at its height, when you had the steel mill strike occurring at Lawrence, all the rest of that, you had mining strikes that were occurring, railroad strikes that had been occurring. Circa 1915, say, 75 to 80% of what you could call the American intelligentsia, they weren't using the word academic then, thankfully, those who were thinking, writing social theory, social analysis, and so forth, were situated in totally non-academic contexts. You had areas like Greenwich Village, you had areas like North Beach, you had areas in Chicago, in every major city, but you also had them in smaller towns as well, where people actually congregated to discuss substantive issues. And the organizing and so forth emerged from that. And yet, all we talk about is how to gain a particular station within the academy. It took them 2 generations to channel Americans' intellectual capacity into institutions that could be defined and controlled in the ways that they are now. It took them a long time after they got that accomplished to get it to the point that it is now. Okay. How much longer have I got that I can go on? Yes, sir. I try to behave myself. Sometimes. It seems to me that a piece that's being overlooked here is, rather than continuing to try to redefine and force changes in a context which is clearly purporting to be something that it's not. I have a few things I'd like to say on that aspect of things too. We look at how do you go about recreating that non-institutionalized, non-housebroken context. It's less conducive to the installation of fear. Now, I can make personal critique. I was doing what I do before I ever came to the University of Colorado. I continue to do what it is that I do while I was at the University of Colorado. I'm no longer at the University of Colorado. I continue to do what I do. University of Colorado was very handy while it lasted for certain purposes, but it didn't define who I was, okay? There's a difference between who I am and what it is that I do by way of a job. My job cannot define me if you allow that to happen. Whether it's a job that you actually hold or the job you aspire to, the functional aspects of your existence, you'll lose track of who it is that you are. And having defined it that way, a threat to that job that is defining will threaten your very, well, it creates an existential crisis, doesn't it? You don't have to be in the academy in order to engage in intellectual activity. And when you do that, when you get outside it, you might actually encounter the very people that are continuously being talked about. How do we manage to reach the voters? I'll have dinner tomorrow night with some gearheads from Longmont that I was engaged in political work with. Okay? I didn't walk in and say, hi, I'm a guy that spent the last 35 years of my life studying political theory and organizing and been engaged in street actions and armed struggle in the Black Hills and various things like that. I walked in and said, what are you guys doing? And they were building an engine. I'm not an engine builder, so they were my instructors. Pick them up where they are. Put the ashtrays back at the table in the goat roper bars. Stop pretending to be so damn pure and have the answers for everybody, Jesuits that you may ultimately be. Try to connect people where they are. You can be surprised where it is they might go with you. Outside of the academy. Whether you're inside or outside, you need to be reaching outside. Okay, but let's get back a minute to academic freedom in the academic context. Now that they've gotten most of the people who are doing intellectual work, those who are not engaged in doing video games and Google and Amazon, and I'm not a computer wonk in any way at all. But I'm pleased to acknowledge that the self-identified computer geek out of the crop this morning doesn't have an iPhone. Neither do I. We have that in common, brother. Flip phones of the world unite. Yeah. And leave it home every chance you get, because it's got a GPS that allows them to track you, and they got simulator stations out there to allow them to do that more effectively. And if you're gonna do something concrete and engaged by it, damn it, do not ever coordinate by cell phone on site. There's a practice that, well, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, some of us actually use it. It was called face-to-face talking to one another, contingency planning. Priorities have to do with hierarchy. We've got to abolish that. No, you know, need to get back to some where the rubber meets the road kind of things. But where the rubber meets the road here, and this is the last thing I'll say, it may take me a couple minutes to get it said, is if you're gonna run the kind of game, play in the arena that's been set up here, there's been a lot of talk about falsification, the academic misconduct, if you will, of that investigative committee in my case. And that's all right and good. That's matter of judicial record, and it was run down thoroughly. It's run down even more thoroughly than in the judicial record. In the report, I understand there's some copies of that available. Yeah, I was accused and I was falsely convicted and la 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 la. But what you have to appreciate is the extravagant lengths that they went to create that appearance. And the noble sounding language, there is noble language actually. I won't quibble with the expression. Okay, the Standing Committee on Research Misconduct in their acceptance of the investigative report. And yeah, this guy's guilty as charged and the execution will be at the stadium wall at noon. That particular document. I'm going to read to you now, proving I can do audiobooks if it came to that. Okay. Providing misleading or incorrect citations, bending accounts to fit one's desired interpretation, or simply making up information, all strike at the foundation of scholarly historical work. Scholars rely upon the accuracy of each other's work to create a cumulative and incremental basis for extending our understanding of events. When that foundation turns out to be based on intentionally fallacious and misleading information, the usefulness of subsequent information is called into question and the work of many scholars may be compromised. There is absolutely nothing to disagree with in that statement. Okay? And succinctly and artfully written, proving that at least some of them knew how to write. Okay? Question then arises, having said that, did they mean it? And no one's really interrogated that other than, well, maybe not, based on the fact that that investigative committee had 11 different research misconducts complaints fired at it, and after having been extolled as this lofty, scholarly ensemble who was upholding the standards of academic endeavor and blah, 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 blah. The response of the institution, having publicized all of that, when they convened a press conference on the outcome of the investigation in my case before even notifying me of the outcome and hanging it online, this amazing work of scholarship, all the trappings of scholarly publication, God knows how many footnotes and direct quotes, and all the conventions were followed. It looked like it was worthy for going over to the University of Colorado Press, although they didn't expend the money, they just posted it online. Okay? 11 that I know of, research misconduct complaints against them were resolved by the sudden decision that this was not actually scholarship after all. Rather, it was an administrative function and not subject to the standards of accountability to which I had been held. Stanley Fish was on pretty firm ground. So in that since they already made the point pretty clear. We believe that when it's convenient as a rationale or pretext for expunging the inconvenient from the discourse. Okay? But we will basically provide immunity to the hatchet men that we send out, the lynch mob that is sent out. They're not going to be prosecuted for the lynching. Yeah? That's where that stands. Well, I was aware of that process, so I decided I'll try something else. Let's try it where it's not arguably an administrative function. I had to ask myself, you know, would that mode of absolution empower the administration to engage in historical falsification, plagiarism? I wasn't actually found to have committed plagiarism. I was found to have ghostwritten material for other people. Different thing, fairly widely practiced, especially in areas like law and political science, but we're not going to go there right now. What happens if we take, say, law school had a pretty heavy hand in this, a distinguished professor of law at the University of Colorado, and subject his work in an area overlapping my own to something resembling the same standards, and file research misconduct complaint on that on the straight up. Here's a book in publication, highly popular, influential, here's what it says, and here's what's wrong with what it says. Here's how it relates to its sources, and so on. Somewhere in here I should have another little pink blurb so I can do another reading. Okay, just homed in. There's a lot more to this, but let me just home in on this. This deals with Pine Ridge Reservation, early 1973, in prelude to the 71-day siege of Wounded Knee. Okay, the reservation was a swarm with emphasized military and law enforcement personnel. Note it says military and law enforcement personnel. Okay, government soldiers mounted machine guns on the roof of the BIA building in Pine Ridge Village. And many troops, emphasized troops, staked out a meeting that was conducted by traditional Lakotas and the American Indian movement at a place called Calico Hall. All right, this begins about 3 weeks before the Wounded Knee occupation occurs, which by the next day is a siege. That is the night of February 28th. Right, well, excuse me, it's the night of February 27th. All right, the siege begins on the 28th of February. So you got 3 weeks time in February during the lead up to that. That's when all of this is happening. Okay? That's in Wilkinson's Blood Struggle, which is pronounced. Well, we're not going to need another book on 20th century American Indian history and affairs and relations with government. This is it. This is the definitive articulation. Yeah. Pages 144, 45, for anybody interested. Okay. Russell Means, who was there, one of the AIM leaders on the ground, and in Oglala, Lakota, Pine Ridge is his reservation. We jointly filed a complaint saying none of that happened. That's absolute falsification. There were no military personnel on site in Pine Ridge until February 3rd, when Volney Warner, Colonel, and Jack Potter, Colonel, okay, one specialist in irregular warfare, the other in logistics for 6th Army, are dispatched by General Alexander Haig at the White House to consult with the civil authorities on the ground. Okay? And there were no more military personnel, per se. That's it. But everything that was just described, all of it happened, involved no military personnel whatsoever. Had it involved military personnel, and I would assume a legal scholar would know this, would have been direct violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, okay, which forbids the introduction of military force into the maintenance of order in the United States other than in circumstance where the president declares an emergency. No emergency had been declared in 1973. So, the United States Army, in effect, has been accused of a criminal enterprise against American Indians, not in 1837, but in 1973. Okay. Standing Committee of Research Misconduct, and that's the collective author of the majestic prose that I read to you just a moment ago, convened a preliminary investigation on this. Okay? And they arrived at the conclusion that there was no misconduct on Professor Wilkinson's part. And the reason being that he was using those terms in a generic sense as opposed to literal reference to the United States Army. Actually provided some entertaining explanation of that position. Okay? Beginning, and then they are supposedly referring to the concise Oxford American Dictionary, okay, which defines military as of, relating to, or characteristic of soldiers or armed forces. Okay? As a noun, the military, the armed forces of a country. You with me so far? Okay. A troop. Here's where it starts to get curious. Okay. First, a group of soldiers, especially a cavalry or an airborne unit. Yeah, that's true. Claro, we're still on ground where he's saying what he seemed to be saying. And the test on this, since it's a popular history, not a technical academic history, is how would a general reader construe what it was that was said? Yeah? Okay, troops, plural. Soldiers or armed forces. A unit of 18 to 24 Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts under a troop leader. A group of people or animals of a particular kind. Okay? And here's my favorite. A troupe of musicians. I don't think that's in the concise Oxford Dictionary. I think since it's italicized, it seems to be additive from the committee. Set in a different typeface. Anybody know how to spell the troupe and troupe of musicians? Yeah. Huh. This somehow becomes T-R-O-O-P, so you can see the standards that are being upheld here. Also, the girls might come trooping in for dinner. All right? Or you could troop on. Now, I don't know what the last really had to do with anything in terms of the usage of the terms by Wilkerson or us in the complaint. We weren't talking about anybody trooping in or trooping on. What does the word troops imply? Well, surely you all remember when the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts teamed up and attacked the American Indian movement tradition with all the elders. Okay, on Pine Ridge Reservation. You could construe it that way. The general reader no doubt would, since he's using the term in a generic sense. Okay, how about soldier? Okay, a person who serves in an army. We're getting a little circular here. A private in an army, particular rank. okay? Or, now we come to my favorite again, a wingless case of ant or termite with a large specially modified head and jaws involved chiefly in defense. Soldados, the army ants. You remember when they marched up from Mexico into South Dakota and began to mount machine guns on top of buildings? Yeah, a general reader no doubt would draw the conclusion he's quite possibly talking about the species of ant or termite here. Okay. In their generic uses, this is explanation now. Military and troops simply referred to armed forces, while soldier could serve in any army. Yeah. On Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota in 1973. That was that year when Canada attacked, came across the border, down through North Dakota, all the way down to the Nebraska line in South Dakota in order to install machine guns on top of the tribal office buildings in Pine Ridge Town, right? Yeah. It's the standards being enforced here, the integrity of scholarship being maintained, even-handed, even-handed. Professor Wilkinson uses the word armies to refer to both the government, law enforcement officials, the modern fully equipped, here's what he actually says, the modern fully equipped corps on the outside. I don't see armies in there. And corps, you could have civilian conservation corps, for example. That's not necessarily specifically a military term, usually used that way. And you could have a corps of law enforcement personnel, but remember, in his framing, he said military and law enforcement, so he's not talking about law enforcement personnel when he's talking about military. You can't have it both ways. Okay. And also, and to the Indians occupying buildings in Wounded Knee, quote, the scruffy guerrillas on the inside. Now, I was in the Army in the context of fighting guerrillas, and I don't remember them being described as an army. I don't remember having read extensively in counterinsurgency warfare theory talking about guerrilla fighters as an army. They're guerrillas. In the discourse, in the vernacular, that's antithetical to being an army. In the context, which is where I was serving, in Vietnam, you had the so-called Viet Cong, that's the guerrillas, and you had what was actually PAVN, People's Army in North Vietnam, referred to in the discourse of the U.S. military and the press as NVA, North Vietnamese Army. Army is distinct from the guerrillas, so we're not really talking about AIM as being a counterposing army. Where's the army? Well, it could be the National Guard. And it is true, Jack Potter did set up an arrangement with the National Guard in South Dakota to provide armored personnel carriers, which were used by a special operations unit of the U.S. Marshal Service and the FBI. They did not provide personnel other than drivers. And we don't think necessarily that's what's under discussion, because that's not what's happening before Wounded Knee. Armored personnel carriers come in actually after Potter was already on the ground, which is during the siege of Wounded Knee. Now we conflate Wounded Knee and Pine Ridge. Okay, they're busy rebutting about what he didn't say about what was going on at Wounded Knee. Well, we weren't talking about Wounded Knee. Wounded Knee happened after what was happening at Calico, which is a specific place in Pine Ridge Reservation, or Pine Ridge Town, which is also a specific place. Wounded Knee is a specific place. Pine Ridge is the reservation. And this has happened in various places, not including Wounded Knee, during a 3-week period in February. But they've totally disproved everything we've said on this basis, as the average reader, based upon this ludicrous attempt at absolution of a scholar who's towing the preferred ideological and narrative line off the hook. Since they had disproven to their own satisfaction that he was not talking about the U.S. Army, since he never said, and used capital letters. You've got to do that. Army has to be capitalized in order for it to be a reference to this institution. He never said U.S. Army at any point on the page span that we were talking about. Okay? And therefore, I guess Canadian Army or the Chinese Army or Boy Scouts or Wing Dance would be as likely, or perhaps it's a reference to the regular and irregular law enforcement, so-called, forces that are deployed on Pine Ridge at town, which I guess might be very anorexically argued if he hadn't divided between the military and law enforcement personnel in the very first sentence going into this. But it gets even better. Step outside the page span where he's talking about things. Unquestionably, it's the U.S. Army that's at issue. He's talking about Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, for example, and he didn't capitalize Army. He doesn't capitalize that at any point in his description of what happened at Wounded Knee. The troops were the troops of the Army. The Army was the Army with a small a. The military was the military, and everybody reading the book would know what he meant. Not only when he's talking about the Wounded Knee Massacre, but when he's talking about the run-up. Okay? And personally, I don't really care if he smudged that one. I'm not trying to uphold the honor of the Army. And he elsewhere says things which are not sufficiently, but nonetheless appropriately tarnishing to the image of the FBI. Might have mentioned that he agreed that he would have done better if, when he mentions a special operations group, which is an elite within an elite, that was a special forces unit that was deployed in Vietnam. U.S. Marshal Service formed what they called a special operations group as well. He allowed us how, if there are future revisions of the book, that he would specify that he's talking about U.S. Marshals in that particular instance. The only thing he was willing to change. We also pointed out that he cites, about a dozen books without pinpoint citations. Just the books. Roland Dewing's Wounded Knee 2, and Rex and Wilder's Blood of the Land, and Macis and Johansson, Wasichu. Okay, I keep taking them off, but the point is, none of those talk about the U.S. Army being there when he was. And he's referencing those books as substantiation of this really sloppy scholarship, and inaccuracy is the worst of that issue. But according to the standards that had to be adhered to as imposed upon me, you had exactly the same set of offense, and they gave him a pass, a walk. And by the way, never publicized the fact that a complaint had ever even been entered. So, I think there's another piece in there if we're going to deal with maintenance of academic integrity, and that being an impairment on academic freedom, constraint in that there be a certain equity on ideological lines, okay, of the standards that are imposed. They need to be out front, before the fact, okay, and they need to be applied to a Charlie Wilkinson or Dean of Cold War Historians John Lewis Gaddis, who didn't have a single, not one, pinpoint citation in an entire book summarizing the Cold War interaction between U.S. and various menaces to its security, notably Soviet Union, but not exclusively so. And it essentially interpreted what he's citing in the books. He invokes the citations on the making of points that are the exact opposite of what's made in the books. Noam Chomsky ran that down. Yale had nothing to say about it. Or one last one, okay, Mr. Chutzpah himself, Harvard law professor, Zionist Supreme, writes a book in defense of Israel. Norman Finkelstein says he basically plagiarized the whole damn thing from Joan, whatever her name was, already thoroughly discredited from time immemorial. Yeah? And he gives several examples. Okay, they took that seriously. They brought Derek Bell out of retirement for 2 weeks, supposedly to read from time immemorial and to read from Defense of Israel, and decided no plagiarism was involved. That was how heavy that came down on somebody who was within the box of orthodox ideological posturing. Okay? Shortly before Finkelstein publishes Beyond Huspah, okay, with 36 pages of side-by-side quotations, virtually verbatim. Time immemorial here, Defense of Israel here. Time immemorial here, Defense of Israel here. Okay? Somehow, I don't know how this happened, Finkelstein also happened to have the markup of the draft that was sent to his assistant with blocking on his name, the professor that wrote Defense of Israel, Dershowitz. Yeah, had his handwritten notes in the margin as to where to look and from time immemorial for the make sure that the language was correct. So it's not only plagiarism, they wanted to be accurately plagiarized but without attribution. You know, 36 pages of verbatim text in both books. One published earlier, one published later. It kind of is a no-brainer, but no misconduct. If we're going to allow people to go down in the way that I was made to go down, and incidentally, I don't feel too down. Because I do quite okay. People count in my world. All right? The people who stuck their heads in the sand keep babbling on about academic freedom when they have none. And have none because they need none, since they're never stepping out of line enough to be a target. I could care less. Y'all bored me all along, which is how I ended up being an American Indian Movement activist, running the Aaup chapter, and on the ground in South Dakota, working with gearheads in Longmont, Colorado, and other things like, there were other things and more important things to do that had to deal with the circumstances and organizing and being of service to actual tangible people rather than taking this self-important citadel so seriously that it sucks up my life and what it is that I might have to contribute in some broader effort and struggle to assign meaning and the potential for change in a constructive way outside of the Kittredge conference room. And with all of that said, I'm going to stand down and see if anybody has a spit water or question or whatever.
Other questions? Oh, none? Okay, thank you. Your question?
I always wondered, Ward, about Michael Radelet. Can you talk about that? And Charles Wilkinson, who lives down the street.
Well, there's another one.
Love, but not after today.
Okay, Michael Radelet, erstwhile chair of sociology at the time, member of the investigative committee, who I discovered after that was over had been cited academic misconduct, distortion, fabrication, and so forth by one state and one federal judge, and was cited in a Supreme Court opinion by our good old dead friend Scalia. Okay? Yeah. Actually, it was quoted at length and reviled. And so I took a look at this and went through it and checked out what it was that was being argued by the judges and said, yeah, that's accurate enough. So I filed that as a complaint too. And they didn't even bother to look at that one. They said, well, that was something he did, was already on his record before he ever came to the University of Colorado. So it wouldn't be in our framework to investigate. So what are you telling me? Take a guy that's accused by a couple of judges on demonstrably accurate grounds of falsifying historical incidents and judicial interpretation. And see, I kind of hated to say that because it was an argument against the death penalty, but it was a fraudulent argument against the death penalty, and I happen to oppose the death penalty because I don't think the government at any level in the United States has the moral authority or standing to execute anyone. I'm not necessarily universalizing that. Death penalty may be appropriate in other contexts, but not in the context at hand. So I really hated to take the argument away from them, but so what's the University of Colorado saying? We hired an academic fraud to be chair of sociology, and we did so knowingly because we decided it was okay? Or were they saying if you did it before we hired you, we have no... Well, yeah, that's a plausible argument, except they took my stuff all the way back to my master's thesis. Couldn't find it, okay, because that was an oral fashion at the institution I was in, but they were doing stuff years before I was ever a faculty member, and that was fair game. So, let's see. How's this work again? Yeah. If they're going to hold people accountable to academic standards to ensure the integrity of scholarship, and I don't disagree with that, then it has to be something other than what Eric Chaffetz called the political construction of research misconduct. Okay? Right-wingers are held to the same standard, or nobody is held to the same standard. How do we go at that? Well, there's a lot of ways we could go at it, and I could talk to people about that later, but I'll simply leave it that way for now. Okay. Yes.
I have a question. Obviously, it was demonstrated that the University of Colorado did you wrong, that they were at fault. Well, did they suffer any kind of sanctions whatsoever that would have prevented such behavior in the future?
Colorado, I didn't even get into my vexed relationship with the AAUP. The Colorado Council of the American Association of University Professors publicized a recommendation that anybody wanted a faculty position and had any possibility of getting one anywhere other than University of Colorado do so. I don't know how much effect that had, but nonetheless, that'd be it. The judge said, essentially, no consequences, immunity, that's what it means. Oh, the judge, Larry Naves, who was a graduate of the University of Colorado Law School, received the University of Colorado Law School's award for alumni service the very next spring. And accepted it, I might add.
No, you earned it.
The orchestrator on all of this, I'll put a name to that, and I'm going to say no more to it, was David Getches, who was another Indian law expert. Okay? Okay? And
It's just stunning.
this is a guy, he was a little bit brighter bulb than the regents, and who was that chump they dragged in here from the foundation to preside over the Churchill case and the football scandal? Senator Hank Brown. Yeah, that is esteemed scholar who, first time he heard, he allowed, two of the regents did this too, they allowed that when they first heard of my famed Little Eichmann statement, they considered it to be something anti-Semitic. And my Jewish lawyer said, why? And it was because they thought Eichmann, based on the name, was Jewish. Yeah. Now, how do you make an argument where you're having to explain and defend everything that elementary to the mindless cretins who are in charge.
That's a
And
good
it's not a matter of the universities being corporatized, although, you know, it's certainly egregious and in your face, and that process is happening, or more accurately continuing, and it's been happening since 1817. In the Dartmouth case, you know how they always say that the American university, they sprang up in the late 19th century trying to replicate the model of the German university, which was the world standard ideal of what a university was. Well, German university wasn't subordinated to any government or any entity. There's a special status in real estate for university campuses. And faculty didn't require tenure or anything along that line because they were freeholders. Once they were appointed by their peers to the faculty, okay? The Board of Trustees at Dartmouth College tried to fire a guy who had come out of the German university, and he filed suit. And the court determined that unlike the European model that was supposedly being replicated in North America, the Board of Regents resembled a corporate board, and the institution, thus, a form of a corporation. Okay, that's not new. And the moment that happened, we deviated from the notion of university in this country. The institutions, including the one we're standing in, are in no sense universities if the word is properly understood. Johns Hopkins might be, it's only a graduate school. But had an actual university been at issue here, there would have been no B school to say, oh, we don't care what you believe, just apologize because you're lowering the value of our degree. Professional schools are professional schools, and I'm not necessarily bad rapping, and it's just the Europeans understood there was something separate from the university. Okay? Trade schools are trade schools, and that kind of training is fine. It should be available to people, be more efficiently available if they were not pretending that they were graduating university students, because it's not part of a university. And you can go back to Upton Sinclair and a couple of others from the turn of the century that are just railing on about that. They brought in a German professor, per se, historian, to the University of Chicago, and that's supposed to become a world-class institution. He did a study of it. He said, you know, there's one actual university in the United States, near as I can tell, and that would be Johns Hopkins, and a couple of them that are aspiring to be, and that would be University of Chicago and Stanford. As for all the rest of this rubble out here that they're calling universities, okay, they're trade schools. They were founded to improve agricultural production and so forth, technical skills impartation. Like I said, nothing wrong with that. Okay? Nothing wrong with peanuts. I eat them all the time. But that does not make them macadamias. Okay? And we've had discussion of that has been put out. People who are being trained in institutions to perform one function, technical function, setting up websites. Take a university degree and hopefully how to spell truth, okay, and how to set up websites. This is not what universities are about, and a whole lot of our problem with the way it goes to faculty and so forth has to do both with corporation and the conflation of different forms of education. When we could separate it out in clear lines and probably do a much better job of justifying what we're doing in a general popular mind and defend faculty rights in those contexts that are appropriate to them at the same time. But faculty is the university in the European sense, at least until the period of the Third Reich. Now everybody's copying the American model, but the American model never had anything to do with the universities. So we used to say as a joke, this location would be a great place to open a school. Why don't we do that? Yeah? Be about time. Okay, you know. If I can squeeze it in, if not,
Okay, if you can. Well, we'd like Peter Bonilla to introduce our next speaker, Alice Drager, in 10 minutes, so. Yeah, squeeze
10
it in.
minutes?
Squeeze it in.
all right, what do you got, you old commie?
Well, Ward, I was going to ask you whether you were surprised that different standards were applied to work which critiqued the standard narrative as opposed to work which supported the standard narrative.
No, I wasn't surprised at all. I just thought maybe it should be said. And the fact is, nobody has said it. But then again, this is a confidential matter. It's not being plastered all over the Rocky Mountain News, so nobody knew about it to say it. So I just thought I would make it known. And in the spirit of transparency they're always talking about, I thought I would put names to it. And I can give you all the committee members' names if you like. Joe Rosie was the head of this whole thing. He's the one that hired the prosecutor, okay? And the prosecutor, actually, I think this was her verbiage
Is that
in the
Mimi
report.
Wilson?
That'll be Mimi Wesson, famous girl detective writer, sitting on her little, with her little dance thing on her stool, posing. I mean, my God, some of this stuff is just bizarre. And by the way, Don, there is a research misconduct complaint I'm filing on you right after this is over for plagiarizing Jim Morrison twice. I mean, there was no attribution to the Doors of the People Are Strange line, okay?
You know, I knew I got it from somewhere.
Well, I heard that song back there, way back when dinosaurs, yeah. No, they actually said that. If you're going to take positions like this, you have to be prepared to defend them much more strongly than if you're just regurgitating stuff nobody needs to read because it's all been said about 50 iterations before. But that education profession room, correct me if I'm wrong, okay, but it's a sort of a recursive technique. You just say the same thing over and over in different contexts from different angles to get the point across and embed it so deeply in mind that creates the box people are going to think in. Yeah, as long as you're participating in that project of filling in or reinforcing the master narrative, you got no problem. That's basically what's been being said here today. Okay? If you're going to challenge it, you got a big problem. They're going to couch it in these lofty terms of preserving the integrity of scholarship, and they don't mean it for a minute. Not a minute. The reverse is true. They will lower themselves to baboon behavior to defend one of their luminaries that's performing the service of furthering the master narrative, shall we say, to a new generation. We don't need another book on this. Here's the be-all, end-all on 20th century American Indian affairs, governmental relations. Yeah. So no, it didn't surprise me. I just wanted to say it, and I want to put some of this stuff on record. So the sheer absurdity of what they came back with to exonerate Wilkinson. I mean, I've done a lot of speaking, but in its way, it speaks for itself much better and more eloquently than I could. So, your shot, and this has got to be the last one.
This will be brief. First of all, I want to defend Don. I don't usually do this, but in the tradition of the blues, people don't cite. Bob Dylan stole from Blind Lemon Jefferson. He didn't cite either. I'm just saying. But I also have a.
Well, you're going to tell me that now Don's going to be eligible for the Nobel Prize?
I'm going to. But I just had a little question. It has nothing to do with academic integrity. It has something to do with what you said earlier, about the military being on Pine Ridge. And I believe that Pine Ridge has the only jet strip in the state of South Dakota where you can land a military jet.
That came a little later. I was after they stomped Fensel into the ground at Pine Ridge Airport, is what you're talking about. And I'm not sure it's military jet. You can bring a Learjet or one of those corporate jets in there, and that's usually what the feds fly around in. They're muckety mucks. That's what it's for. You got a strategic air command base, what, 65, 70 miles north of Pine Ridge, Ellsworth Air Base. They don't need to be able to land jet aircraft there. When they came in force, they came in Huey helicopters. Okay? And full Vietnam combat equipment. Yeah. I really gotta get out of the way of the next speaker.
Well, I was just thinking about this idea of sort of filing research misconduct claims. I was thinking about this idea of filing research misconduct claims to demonstrate to the university that basically their use of these claims in your case was just a naked exercise of politics and power. And
Yeah.
pretty sadly unsophisticated at that. Not even very elegant, exercise of power. So, but what I'm wondering is, I mean, I don't think there's any hope in that strategy in this sense. These research misconduct claims are so discretionary and so subject to abuse that they're never going to be a promising area to sort of get at the people in power. And I think the best you can do, so I'm wondering what your thoughts are, is delegitimize that tactic. Delegitimize research misconduct. Make it very, very hard to prove research misconduct, decrease the level of fear over getting a research misconduct claim, and give more freedom. And I just wonder, like, your tactic, just talk to me a little bit about it.
That's all it is. You're not going to get any of them on it, but you're going to just spread. The more of those, and there is nothing to prevent. Their rules notwithstanding, they violate their rules all over the place. So there is absolutely nothing to prevent you as a complainant from making your complaint public. Okay? And the point of that is to discredit the process. If they're not going to apply it in equitable fashion, then make it really suspect for them to attempt to apply it to anyone. That's all. Don't cut the legs out from under. Either you're going to do it both ways, all ways, or no ways. Okay? Of course, you don't have to do it in any way at all to convince a whole sector of the population of what it is they want to convince. All you gotta do is make the accusation. Okay. I'm out.